86-18. This is the second proposed reg on opportunity zones, and it was published in the Federal Register on May 1st. We appreciate you all coming, traveling to New Carrollton. This is new for us at the Office of Chief Counsel. Most of our public hearings are held in our building downtown, but we had such an overwhelming group. We had a lot of people come for the first NPRM. So we would this is what New Carrollton holds for us. So I'm going to start with introductions for the panel. First, to my far right, we have Shireen Flance. She's a senior technician reviewer from ITMA, and she will be our clock keeper today. Then we have Sonia Kotari as general attorney from Pass-Throughs and Special Industries. And right to my direct right is Robert Sirkovich, special counsel to the Associate Chief Counsel, PSI. To my left, we have Michael Novi, one of our Treasury representatives on the panel. He is the Associate Legislative Counsel, Associate Tax Legislative Counsel, the Office of Tax Policy with the Department of Treasury. To his left is Brian Rimke, who's the Attorney Advisor and another Treasury representative. He's from the same office as Mike, Office of Tax Legislative Counsel. I'm sorry, Brian, I have a different Department of Treasury.
We're all
all from the Department of Treasury.
All Office of Tax Policy.
And then down at the far left is Russell Jones, who's the Special Counsel to the Associate Chief Counsel for Corporate. So once again, thank you so much for traveling up here. There's a lot of energy behind this statute. It's a very exciting new area of the tax law, and we appreciate all your help to getting to the right place for these regulations. We have reviewed all the written comments that have been submitted, and we thank you for those comments. Today we have 19 speakers, allotted 10 minutes each, with possible follow-on questions from our panel. Also, this hearing is being recorded. For all the speakers that are here today, the black box on the lectern will be green while you are speaking. A yellow light will turn on when you have 2 minutes left, and then a red light will come on at exactly 10 minutes. We ask that you stay within your time limit so we don't have to bring out the hook. That will be Shireen's job. But we want to hear from everyone who has asked to speak. And if we have time at the end, we will open up the mics that are out in the audience for anybody else who has comments. We plan on breaking around noontime for lunch. It depends on where we're at with speakers, but around noontime. You will need, so the lunchroom is actually, if you go out the doors to where you came in with security, there's an escalator that takes you up to the next floor, and the lunchroom is to the left. And you will need escorts to go into the lunchroom. And we have some in the back, in the lobby back there. Restrooms are out the doors, so the auditorium doors, to the left. It's a little hallway to the left, and the restrooms are down there. We will call the speakers up in order on our list of speakers, but if someone is late or is, and then just a reminder, please put all your cell phones on mute. And there is no food or drinks in the auditorium, but they are allowing water today because they expect us to go for a long time. Okay, so Mike, did you want to have a comment?
Yes.
First, thank you for sacrificing your time and convenience to come here to help us. As I was walking in down the aisle, I overheard a couple of people saying that reg hearings like this one would be much better if there were some musical interlude between speakers. And I began wondering, well, what would be the most appropriate music? And I think from our perspective, it would be that we can get by only with a little help from our friends, and in this respect, you all are our friends. Because you are here to give us some recommendations, I want to start off with a few recommendations about how you can be most helpful to us, since clearly that is why you went to the trouble to get here. And this is particularly important in light of Shireen's anticipated draconian employment of the time. One, we are governed by the language that Congress enacted and the President signed. As a matter of human interest, we understand many people's frustration and disposition with certain aspects of the language that's there. But we are not legislators, and any use of your time to describe how we should do something that really isn't in the statute, even if it's consistent with your perception of the statute's purpose, will be interesting, but it won't help us to write the regs. Second, your presence here and your interest in our regulations are all the credentials that you need for us to take your comments seriously. Any more than a one-sentence introductory description of yourself and your organization is using up time that would be better spent, from our perspective, telling us what we ought to do. Many of your written comments, in fact, provide very impressive backgrounds, personal CVs, institutional descriptions. We've got those. And if you can use your precious 10 minutes to tell us what we ought to do, that's much better. Your being here is enough for us to take you seriously. And then finally, if you can, please try to be concrete. If we should clarify something, and I'm sure there are, of all the comments that we're getting, I suspect that the largest single comment is, please clarify X. Give us an example. Tell us what a clarification would look like. Even if it's not the best one, even if we could come up with something better than that after a while, it is much better than saying, please clarify it, and we are left saying, well, we knew that was clear. We had, if we had known how to clarify it, we might have done it back when we published the notice. So if you can be concrete, that is one of the most helpful things you can do. Thank you for your time and effort. We're all ears.
Okay, so let's start with the speakers, and I apologize now if I mess anybody's name up, but we're going to start with William Cunningham, who is representing himself.
Well, good morning. Is this thing on? Outstanding. So I'm Bill Cunningham. I'm actually here representing Creative Investment Research, which is a company I've run for about 25 years. If you want to follow along with my comments, go to creativeinvest.com/oz.pdf. creativeinvest.com/oz.pdf is where this presentation is. Now, I'm going to talk about, I testified at the first hearing that you had. Thank you very much for doing that. By the way, I know this is hard work. I really do. Dealing with the public. I deal with the public all the time. Public is tough to deal with these days, you know. So I appreciate your efforts in this area, especially with a program as important as this. Now, as you know, our concerns are that the Opportunity Zone program seems to allow people with significant capital gains a way to escape their responsibility for paying taxes. And it allows mainly white and wealthy taxpayers to avoid their social responsibility in exchange for investments via qualified opportunity funds in 8,700 poor communities, mainly Black and Hispanic communities. So our economic analysis leads us to believe that the program is fundamentally unfair and fiscally unsound. We conducted a survey on the Opportunity Zone program to ask a couple of questions. We wanted to find out if people thought that the Opportunity Zone program favored the wealthy, favored the poor, or was neutral. Based on our survey, 44.74% of the people that responded thought that the program favored the wealthy, 5.26% concluded that the program favored the poor, and 50% actually indicated that they thought the program was neutral. Now, in terms of the impact, the social impact, what we do is we create impact investments. That's what we've been doing for the past 25 years. And in terms of the impact, projected impact of the Opportunity Zone on communities, according to our survey, 68.42% of the people that responded thought that the Opportunity Zone program would increase gentrification, 10.53% thought that it would decrease gentrification, and 21.05% thought that the program would have no effect on gentrification in those 8,700 communities. Now, as we testified last time, part of the issue is that the assumptions concerning the Opportunity Zone program are very much like the assumptions that we see being utilized to justify programs that take economic resources out of Black and brown communities. We've seen this most recently with the new introduction of a cryptocurrency called Libra. Facebook is positioning this currency as something that they're going to use to provide banking services to 1.7 billion. No, look, it's about shareholder wealth maximization. It's about control. So it is with the Opportunity Zone program. Marketed as a program that's going to bring economic development to Black and brown communities, we know based on the history of other programs like the New Market Tax Credit Program, like the CRA programs, we know that these programs have a tendency to reduce economic opportunity for Black and brown people that were resident in those geographic areas prior to the introduction of these programs. If you don't believe me, look at 14th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. That's all you have to do. So we're concerned about the negative externalities that a program like this will impose on Black and brown people in the 8,700 communities. Now, we also know that a program like this diverts needed tax revenue from public programs to private purposes. We know that in places like California, there's a massive need for investment in infrastructure to deal with climate change. We know that in Illinois, there's a need for police and community development in minority communities. Taking money away from the federal treasury will not help these regions provide the services that those communities need. We know that in the state of Texas, there's a massive need for integrating new populations into the state. And we know that in New York, there are infrastructure and social needs that are critical, especially in light of the reversal of certain private companies from coming into certain parts of the state. I'm talking about Amazon. Now, our suggestions are twofold. The first is, and I understand this may be something that you cannot regulate, but our first suggestion would be that you be very clear that there's to be no benefit to the president, to senators, to congressmen, to state governors, and to others who had a hand in selecting those 8,700 communities. No benefit personally from investments that they hold in those communities. The second recommendation that we made was that you use something called Ethereum, the Ethereum blockchain. Blockchain technology is basically a distributed public database that is hard to manipulate, that you basically use this new technology to report on Opportunity Zone investment social impact. And we've outlined an impact measurement strategy that would basically allow you to collect and analyze impact data, to evaluate the data, and then to possibly, and again, this is beyond your capability, but what we would like to see is we would like to see the social impact data used to calibrate the tax credit. You want to put a liquor store in Anacostia using the Opportunity Zone tax credit. The rules say that these types of sin businesses are not allowed. But we know that the second tranche of the regulations actually provide a safe harbor where there are going to be companies that utilize, that are able to put in sin businesses in Opportunity Zone communities. If you don't believe me, there was an Opportunity Zone podcast that I'm happy to send you that outlined exactly how that would work. So what we'd like to see is we'd like to see the Opportunity Zone tax credit calibrated to the social impact of the business. So that if you put affordable housing in Anacostia, you should get the entire tax credit, no question about it. You put a liquor store in Anacostia, you should get 5% of the tax credit. Some type of calibration that measures social impact and reduces or increases the tax benefit accordingly. Now again, complicated, hard to do, but we know that there are certain entities, Beak Center at Georgetown University, interest of full disclosure, I'm a member of the faculty at Georgetown. I have nothing to do with the Beak Center's social impact methodology as it relates to opportunity zones. But I'm simply pointing out that there is one. And it could be utilized to do exactly what I've just suggested in the interest of specificity, I guess. So those would be our main recommendations. If you look at the presentation, again, creativeinvest.com/oz.pdf. At the end of the presentation, you will see a social cost calculation mock-up. Oh, this thing is moving. I don't want to fall off the stage here. But you'll see a social cost mock-up that is basically our idea as to how you would take the social impact data from that Ethereum blockchain that we suggested and put it into a dashboard that anybody could utilize to see what the social impact of Opportunity Zone investments are. Now, this is something, again, I don't know how you would regulate that. I really don't, but I know that it's doable. I know that the technology that has been developed now allows you to do things which you could not do 20 years ago. And I'm suggesting you use it for this purpose. So I think that about covers my comments. Any questions? No, I'm just kidding. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Cunningham. Our next speaker is Mary Scott Hardwick from the Opportunity Finance Network.
Good morning. My name is Mary Scott Hardwick. I work with Opportunity Finance Network, which is a national trade association of community development finance institutions. We have 270 members, and we are a CDFI ourselves as well. Collectively, our members have provided over $65 billion in responsible lending to disinvested communities throughout the country. So we are excited about the chance for additional capital to flow into these communities, but are concerned about whether proper regulations have been written to ensure that the benefits flow through to the communities and to the residents of those communities. In order to do that, we have 3 areas that I'm going to cover today. First, reporting requirements, anti-fraud and anti-abuse provisions, and then finally, ensuring investment in operating businesses. So first, on the reporting requirements, OFN is supportive of the Opportunity Zones framework that was developed by the Beck Center and the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, and we support transaction-level reporting requirements with impact measurements, and making that data publicly available at least once a year. This will allow communities to see what's going on, what sort of investments are being made, evaluations to be made of the program to ensure that it is worth the tax benefit or the tax loss that is occurring, and it will allow people to compare zones to see if rural areas are seeing more investment or urban areas, or how the program is working and where it may need to be tweaked in the future. We also believe that reporting requirements are one of the best ways to deter fraud and abuse. If people know that they're going to have to submit, transaction level data, they need to be doing what they're supposed to be doing. In addition, on the anti-abuse provisions, we have a couple of places that do need to be clarified. The first is the improvements for vacant land when it is acquired. Currently, the regulations state that it doesn't need to be substantially improved, but in a different area, it talks about how it needs to be more than insubstantially improved. So that's pretty confusing for someone trying to figure that out. So for example, we would want to make sure that if somebody acquires 50 acres of land, that they're not putting some small, minimally impactful commercial development on a quarter acre and saying that they've improved the land enough. If you're acquiring large pieces of property, there needs to be a threshold for how much you need to improve it, and having that clarity will help investors move forward. The conference report that passed with HR 1 indicates that certification for funds should be similar to the New Markets Tax Credit Program, and we support that, including adding things that are required in the New Markets Tax Credit Program, such as having fund managers certify that they haven't been convicted of certain financial crimes within the past 3 years. We think that's a common sense check that's already in other Treasury regulations for similar programs, and we would support adding that. We also suggest extending the ban on SIN businesses, not just for opportunity funds, but to qualified opportunity zone businesses. Currently, a fund can't invest in a SIN business, but the qualified opportunity zone business does not have the same restriction on it, so that creates a loophole for somebody being able to pass through funding there. So we would encourage you to clarify that and make it uniform across the board. Finally, we are looking for some additional clarity around the reasonable cause for a fund to fail a 90% asset test. I think there's concern that, it could be too broad and people would be not making those investments, or if it's too narrow, you would have people who are unwilling to maybe make a riskier investment in a low-income community because they're scared they may fail a 90% asset test if a business plan falls apart or something like that. So it would be very helpful to have clear definitions of what reasonable cause is and how a fund would meet that 90% requirement. Finally, we would like to thank Treasury and the IRS for this set of regulations for providing a lot more information about investing in operating businesses. We believe that job creation is the only way that this is going to provide true economic benefit. So we are encouraged that those pieces are in there. We are a member of the Economic Innovations Group Opportunity Zones Working Group, which they're going to be testifying later, and we support the recommendations in their letter, and we're a co-signatory of their letter with recommendations on how to improve it for operating businesses. So thank you for the opportunity to talk today.
Panel, do you have any questions? And I apologize because I didn't ask the panel for questions for Mr. Cunningham. So Mr. Cunningham, we'll wait to the end, and if anybody has a question for him, we can ask them. Does anybody have any questions? I have one.
Okay.
So the vacant land rule?
Yes.
Do you have a number in your head for threshold?
I don't have a number in my head, but I believe it does need to be more clearly defined.
If we had come up with it, we would have put it in the proposal.
The proposal that you mentioned regarding the certification, there are, for a variety of arcane procedural aspects of Senate process, the statute has to change between that time and the time it's enacted. But how much time between the submission for certification and receipt of certification would you anticipate would be a tolerable delay for qualified opportunity funds? And if there were as few as one per zone, we're talking about staffing over 8,700 hands-on certifications. Is that really consistent with the speed and flexibility that Congress appears to have desired?
We believe, and from reading the conference report and talking to members on the Hill, that they do support having certification in there. I don't have an exact number for exactly.
How many FTEs per certification?
I would not know that. I don't.
I mean, what I'm saying is that we also read that legislative history. And had we said you must send something into an office like the CDFI, and you need to wait until certification comes back, that would have been consistent with the legislative history. It would have been highly problematic with respect to the structure of the statute with its stress on flexibility and rapidity.
I agree that it would take additional resources in order to do that. The position of our organization is that it's worth that investment and time.
So, but you know, with our current resources, should we simply slow things down in order to have certification?
I believe that the Treasury has found a way to do it with several other programs, and I would encourage you to do as much as you can.
Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Kevin Matz from the American College of Trust and Estate Council.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Kevin Matz, I'm a tax, trust, and estates lawyer, also CPA, part of the Strict Law Firm in New York City. I'm speaking on behalf of the American College of Trust and Estates Council on trust and estate specific issues under the proposed regulations. In our comment letter, we identified 5 just for to move things along. I'm going to start with the second one, but just very briefly by way of background. Again, we're talking about a trio of benefits, 3 different benefits to investors by investing in this program. Number 1, they get a chance to defer capital gains until the earlier to occur under the statute of sale or exchange of the interest in the qualified opportunity fund. Again, they have to invest in the qualified opportunity fund within 180 days of that, or deemed 180 days. Or the outside date, which is December 31, 2026. So sale or exchange, or December 31, 2026, whichever comes first according to the statute, that's a trigger point for an inclusion event. Second benefit to be derived, so you have tax deferral, you could possibly, through basis adjustments, eliminate up to 15% of the capital gain. If you hold the interest in the qualified opportunity fund for 5 years, you get a 10% basis step up. If you hold it for 7 years, you get 5% on top of that. So that's 15% in total that could be eliminated. And then thirdly, the troika benefits. If you happen to have the investment in the qualified opportunity fund, including tacking by virtue of someone dying and the like, and you get to 10 years, and there's subsequent appreciation value, the interest goes up in value, then that appreciation is completely tax-free. So what are some of the issues that are presented in the trust and estates field? I'm actually going to go to point 2, because I think that, now, I think in terms of trust and estates means people die, taxes, but they also can make gifts. You can have lifetime transfers. So what happens if you gift an interest in the qualified opportunity fund? My thought, when I was reading the statute, was, well, the statute talks about what's the triggering event. Sale or exchange, or December 31, 2026? Is a gift a sale or exchange? The answer, at least according to the plain unambiguous language of the statute, I would submit should be no. It says sale or exchange, and that's what it says under section 102, a gift or bequest is not a sale or exchange. So under the Internal Revenue Code, plain unambiguous language, it should not be treated, I would respectfully submit, as a taxable event. However, under the second tranche proposed regulations that came out on May 1st, it is treated as an inclusion event unless you happen to have a gift or actually, quote unquote, a contribution to a special type of trust that is called a grantor trust, which is treated as one and the same person as the person who makes a contribution for income tax purposes. Now, I looked at that, I compared it to the statute, it does, very respectfully, it does not square with the statute, and that was noted in the preamble to the proposed regulations. With the proposed regulations here in the preambles then said, they went back to the legislative history, the conference report, and in the conference report, it talks about a disposition, and it goes off the sale and exchange concept. You'll see that in the comment letter, and this again begins the part 2, beginning on page 6. We go very meticulously through the conference report. It doesn't evidence an intent to basically change a very clear precept in the Internal Revenue Code. Again, I respectfully submit that. If Congress wanted to have gifts deemed as sales or exchanges, so as to trigger this, they could have done it very easily. They did not. And again, there's nothing that if you look at the entire legislative history in the conference report, again, I've quoted language verbatim, that would suggest that there is some loose language, but then if you view it in context, it does not show an intent for expansive reading to override what's in the plain and ambiguous language of the statute. So that is one point that we would request revision on. I talked about gifts being an exception, but there's an exception as there is in the Internal Revenue Code. We love our exceptions to exceptions, and there is the case of if, instead of having an outright gift, say to an individual, I give it to my son, make a gift to my son of an interest in qualified opportunity fund, which would be a trigger. Again, under the proposed regulations, I submit it should not be consistent with the statute. But if instead I made a gift to a grantor trust, which is a trust that usually I would create, that for tax purposes has certain triggers in it that cause it to be one and the same as me, for income tax purposes, then the proposed regulations, corrected, state that that is disregarded, and that will not be an inclusion event. If there's a further distribution from the trust, and it's not by reason of death, that could be an inclusion event down the road, but the actual contribution of an interest in a qualified opportunity fund to a grantor trust would not be that. And just following along, this is the third point that begins over on page 10 of the ACTEC report. So what are some of the issues that are raised there? Well, couple things you need to bear in mind with grantor trust. So number one, the grantor, so being the example, I set up a trust, I retain certain powers, including maybe the power of substitute assets of equivalent value as a grantor trust trigger, section 675(4)(c) of the code. That allows it to be a grantor trust, and the income that's derived from the assets, including the qualified opportunity fund, they are all taxed to me during my lifetime as the grantor. So that's one benefit. Basically, it all flows through. There's another important provision that needs to be considered, and that is Revenue Ruling 85-13. Revenue Ruling 85-13. And that says that if I have a transaction with a grantor trust, let's say I were to sell assets to the grantor trust, could be whether it's an interest in a qualified opportunity fund, and I get back cash or a promissory note or other property in kind, it's as though I'm dealing right pocket, left pocket, all with myself. It's a tax nothing for income tax purposes. Revenue Ruling 85-13 says basically across the board it's a tax nothing. Respectfully submit that the proposed regulations should similarly have, or rather the regulations finalized should similarly so state that, so that not only a contribution of an interest in a qualified opportunity fund, and the proposed regulations talk about a contribution. Interesting, the preamble talks about a gift. Presumably that's one and the same. If that could be clarified, that would be very helpful. But if I were to have other transactions that are within the purview of 85-13, basically anything during my lifetime while as a grantor trust, it could be a sale, it could be a swap of assets, it could be a distribution, including in kind, that should not be an inclusion event. And it seems to be consistent with the intent here, but that needs to be clarified. Importantly, because grantor trust also is treated as one and the same as me, it should not matter if the source of funds that are used to go to the qualified opportunity funds come from the grantor trust or come from me directly. Again, Revenue Ruling 85-13, grantor trust provisions 671 through 679 of the code, treated as one and the same, and therefore that should be respected all the way across the board here. Now, what are some of the other issues? I'm going to point 4, which is on page 11. Here are some items to consider. There were, in the proposed regulations that came out, actually the first tranche that came out last year, very helpful relief provisions to the 180-day rule. That's basically the rule that says you have a capital gain, you have 180 days to invest in the qualified opportunity fund. If you don't, you lose the opportunity to defer and have possible basis adjustments, and then after 10 years of depreciation, be able to avoid tax on that. On the gate. That's very helpful. where this could be problematic, let's say, and there were some relief provisions. So one relief provision says that if I have to be a partner in a partnership, instead of looking at the partnership, it could, unless an election is made to the contrary, it could be the partner who then has the ability to defer the gain, because the partner gets taxed on it anyway, based on, by receiving a K-1. And then, unless an election is made otherwise, it's the end of the tax year that's used for the 180-day period to start. So that would be, in most cases, many cases, December 31. So I could have had, the partnership could have had the sale occur February last year, well over a year ago. But because it was a partnership and because an election was made otherwise, December 31, 2018 could have been the trigger date to start the 180-day clock, and as long as the investment was made by June 29th of this year, it would qualify. What are some of the issues that arise, partnerships, S corporations, and also apply to trusts and estates? This is dependent on effective communication between effectively the fiduciary, the manager, and the beneficiary or partner or S corporation shareholder. And the communication device is the K-1. And that works wonderfully if the tax returns are filed properly, the K-1s are issued promptly, and then all that gets shared. But that's not how the real world often works. Quite often, especially with any measure of complexity, quite often with partnerships, S corporations, and also trusts and estates, returns go on extension. And if returns go on extension, you're talking about due dates in September, October for the K-1 to even have to issue. And by the time the partner or S corporation shareholder or beneficiary of the trust or estate gets the K-1, lo and behold, you'll see as described in the example that I provide in materials, it could well be September. And at that point, they're completely out of luck because they're more than 180 days out from the window. So our proposal here is that just as there was relief provided for the 180-day situation in the case of partnerships, that in order to achieve the incentives, the objectives here of substantial economic investment in economically distressed communities, i.e. opportunity zones with capital gains, the funding mechanism, there should be an allowance here that says the 180-day period runs from the later of the 180-day period under the current proposed regulations, or if later, 180 days from the filing of the timely filed, including extensions to the tax return that issued the K-1. My time is very short, just a couple brief points. Basis adjustments, what happens upon death under section 691, which is incorporated by reference here, there is no step up in basis. However, you'll see, and this is 0.5, if however, there is appreciation value through date of death, that is not an amount that's recognized in this section pursuant to the language of the statute. Therefore, that amount should not be tied to 691, which basically carries over the deferred gain to the person who happens to be holding on to the investment at the time of the recognition event, such as December 31, 2026. And that amount through date of death should be subject to step up in basis. And then just the last point, 15 seconds, and I see that I'm out of time. What happens to an inheritance where someone inherits an interest in qualified opportunity fund, and lo and behold, they have nothing to pay the tax on December 31, 2026 for request relief. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Matz. Panel, do we have any questions? Okay.
Do you see, okay, do you see in the code any mechanism for donee tax liability?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Okay, you suggested that gift should not count as should not count as an inclusion event.
Yes.
Are you suggesting that the sale or exchange by the donee would trigger a tax liability for the donor if the donor happens to know of it? Or are you suggesting that the sale or exchange by the donee triggers liability for the donor's historic capital gains?
Well, I think better reasoned result here should be that the donee, upon receiving it, unless we have a grantor trust, so a grantor
No,
trust would be completely different. Let's say I'm making it to myself.
Yeah, we're talking about not a grantor trust.
In that case, the sale or exchange by the donee should trigger tax to the donee. That I think is a better reason to.
And
And the,
if
there would be a
the
tax.
donee sells, and, let's say hypothetically that, you know, if the donee may have, some, gain because of the low basis that it picks up. But, you're saying that the, donee then picks up the historic gain by the donor.
Right, and that would be consistent with how.
That might have been a very reasonable way for Congress to have drafted it. But do you think that, a donee who says, I don't see any obligation on my part, I got a gift, I don't owe anything for gains that my, kind uncle may have deferred, before I was born?
Well, in that case, the donee has an obligation enforceable by the Internal Revenue Service and.
Under what section?
Well, if the donee has property and it has zero basis, perhaps, or maybe an adjustment of basis over the course of time of putting that aside, so a zero basis, and it sells it, it has a gain. It has a capital gain, presumably, that then will trigger tax consequences to the donee. If the donee fails to pay it, that is tax evasion.
And if the donee has losses, then so be it, the donor's, liability is subsumed in the donee's losses.
Well, that actually is a situation that applies right now. So it could be that a donor has a capital gain, doesn't make a transfer, or an individual's capital gain does not make a gift to a donee, and then in a year prior to 2026 has losses, sells the interest of the qualified opportunity fund then, and then is able to basically have zero tax. So that's no change from the current situation and posture of the case.
In terms of clarifying that the, tax nothing attribute of the grantor of trust that are reflected, is there anything else, is there anything in the current proposed regulations where you see an implication that we would fail to reflect in respect of Rule 8513?
That's an excellent point. I don't see anything that necessarily cuts away at it, but it isn't addressed, and therefore it would be very helpful to clarify.
There are lots of obvious consequences of current law that we don't address.
That is
The regs are
true.
long enough as it is.
That is true. But it could be that maybe simply an example to say that if there's a sale, take back the promissory note, that is governed by Revenue Rule 85-13, and therefore it effectively is the same sort of work if because it's a tax number.
Finally, you raised the point in your comments that the IRD may put the beneficiary in the posture of having tax liability for which it has no capacity to pay. Are you suggesting something like an automatic with underpayment interest extension of the liability date so that the liability would be measured at an appropriate time, but there would be recognition of the fact that the persons liable for the IRD ought to get some temporal relief that where Treasury is made whole by interest?
That is an excellent suggestion. If some relief is needed, because anytime you plan right now, basically, you almost have to plan the life insurance. You have to talk about that, which means then you have to have the traditional setup of a reputable life insurance trust to make it tax efficient. And then you have to match the trustee and the beneficiaries to whoever has the interest in qualified opportunity fund. There's a lot to take into account. Some sort of relief is needed, and I do completely understand your point that, well, the statute says that, and how far can you go beyond the statute, but if there's some sort of relief provided, installment payment plan, and that could be administratively built in, that would go a long way to addressing this concern.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Our next speaker is James Rose from the Rose Development LLC.
Hello, and thank you. It's great to be here. I was here at the first hearing back in February. That was going to be in January. And I was here with my wife. And the reason why we were here back then was that I am a developer. I am not an attorney. I'm not an accountant. And I'm also partnered with the state of Utah on some of my developments. And one day, I'm having one of my partnership meetings, and the director walks in with this letter from the governor nominating 47 census tracts, and says, "Can you look this up and tell me what is this?" You know, and it was the first time I'd ever heard of anything like that. It was in about April or June, about June 1st. And boy, this has really changed things for us. Because at first I was like, well, what the heck? Where's the map that shows me where these census tracts are so I can understand what properties that we have with the state of Utah that we're developing and giving a large portion of the money to the students, you know, whether or not these developments are inside an opportunity zone. And so it really, it sent us down a certain path. Then we decided, well, we better, once we figured out that it had to go through a fund, and then it had to go to, you know, go through all the regulations and the processes, we decided we better do a fund. Well, then it was like, well, we need to find an attorney that knows this and can help us do this the right way. So we drafted a set of documents, and we found out that there were going to be these regulations, these guidance, comments and whatnot. Well, here is the first and second regs right here, right? The first one came out in October. It was about 73 pages, and it set us back because we thought, whoa, there are really so many issues, not being an attorney, not being an accountant, that I didn't even know were possible issues in the first place, right? I mean, we're developers. I'm a licensed general contractor. I was a licensed general contractor builder in the state of Utah when I got my license. I'm also a principal broker in Utah and in Nevada. So I know a lot about transactions as it comes to real estate building and doing things like that. So this process that we've been going through has kind of led us to the point where we're thinking, all right, how do we take something so complicated and make it simple for us to really be able to use, right? And for us to be able to explain to our friends, and for my wife and I to do our family planning with for the next, till 2047, right? And so, one of the funny things that happened to us is that on December 7th, 2017, my wife and I closed on about 20 assets in an opportunity zone for the purpose of improving these assets, you know, for the community and doing exactly what the law really helps developers do, but we did it about 20 days too soon, right? So we understand how important it is to know all the little nuances of this law. So what we want to do is make it as simple as possible in the big ways for when people can, so that normal people can understand and verify what fund managers, now we're fund managers, right? We're not just developers and builders. Now all of a sudden we have to manage a fund, we're a fund manager for our own projects. But so that when we talk to other people as fund managers, that they can get the information without having to hire a bunch of accountants and attorneys for just the big concepts, right? And that's why I wrote all my comments about the IRS website, www.irs.gov. And it's a wonderful resource and tool. I think it could be updated a little bit. You know, we have these regs that have been coming out, and there's some really great things that haven't kind of transferred over onto the website that I think could happen. And there could be more of the kind of, you know, opportunity zones for dummies kind of sections, right? And it kind of gets into what...
Or maybe even just opportunity zones for real people, rather than...
Yeah, yeah, because sometimes we feel like dummies when we're kind of going through this. You know, and when you look at my, you know, I like to rip things off. And I've been printing off everything that you've been, submitting and writing to us, and cross-reference it, and, trying to figure it all out. And some of the things, we should be able to rely on as normal people. And some of the things, yeah, we might need to, get our attorneys to give us an opinion on. But there should be parts that we don't have to do that for. And so one of the things that I noticed on the website recently, because I went back to check before all of this came, was that in the frequently asked questions page on opportunity zones, there should be more detail and clarification given as to what is a qualified opportunity fund. Currently, the FAQ, the fact page, answers the question, what is a qualified opportunity fund? With an answer indicating that it is a vehicle for investing in eligible property located in a qualified opportunity zone. Right? For someone unfamiliar with the Act, the stated answer could be interpreted as only including real property located within an opportunity zone. This interpretation would miss an additional and major benefit of the Act, which is the investment in qualified opportunity zone businesses. And given the potential for growth and positive impact that QOZBs can bring to opportunity zones, this benefit of the Act should be more clearly stated in the answer. So as somebody from my local community of Utah, where we have 47 zones, and my office was located by somewhat inside of an opportunity zone, I look at this and I start speaking to people about it, and all of a sudden they start looking at me in my local community like I'm some kind of an expert. And so I keep saying, well, listen, I am not an expert in this, but I am the guy that just recently held the first stakeholders meeting in my community with the mayors of my communities and the city council members and so on and so forth. And not one of them knew hardly anything about this, and the misconceptions were just unbelievable. So articles have come out and people have started calling me, and I'm sitting here thinking, how can we make this the most reliable for everyone? And that is pointing back to the IRS website. We could have these, little bit better pieces of clarification that people can go and fact check what others are telling them, whether it's their attorneys or whoever it might be. And then I reluctantly bring this last part up, which is just about the Act itself. I know that you don't want to really hear that, but as we have gone through different revisions of PPMs, or private placement memorandums, if there's anybody else out there like me that may have never been into these things before, we have had revision after revision based off of the guidelines. But when we look at raising additional funds from people, we can only right now bring in tax advantage or deferred capital gains money. And I know that you have to change the Act, and we're not here to do that, okay, the law. But wherein you have latitude to kind of make exceptions or create possibilities where some of the people that call me that want to move their businesses into these zones, that want to do kind of like 10-year planning, if it's something that you can do where, the part where if they leave their money in there for 10 years, and there's capital gains, it shouldn't really matter, that's my big point, whether that money came from capital gains. If they're willing to go through all the rules, yeah, they're not gonna get an increase in basis, none of that applies to them, but they should be able to get some of those benefits. And I don't know all the ways in which you could make that possible, where there could be, hey, they're leaving their money in those funds in the fund, right, for 10 years. And the fund then is investing in the QOZBs or QOZBPs, these projects. If you're not able to in some way make that happen so that that money can be tax advantaged, then perhaps as we are selling or making money, capital gains in our QOZBs, and then we're sending that money back up to our QOFs, right, our qualified opportunity funds, then maybe there's something that we can do that clarifies the ability to take those capital, some of that money somehow. I mean, I don't know where the latitude is here, but it would be extremely helpful. But either way, the more simple we can make this. And one other point about the IRS website, you could even have a little section that said, if you're a QOZB, a business, and you want to do a QOZB, here are the 1, 2, 3s, or like a checklist of 10 things that you need to start off with. That would be incredibly helpful. And that's it. That's all I had to say.
Any questions for Mr. Rose?
One, in terms of sharing your predilection for printing stuff out and then coming across something that is in need of clarification. When I printed your hearing outline, I came across 1K3-9ALY-BB67, which, and then something else as well with a similar opacity. It's comments that you say you had submitted before, but I wasn't smart enough to figure out where to find them. So I would love,
PRM one?
Like, you know, and
we would love to see them.
I will, I apologize for that, and that there again, this is my first time ever getting involved in something like this.
No, I
Hearing it, thank you.
I mean, that, you know, I saw the summary of what you said.
Yeah.
Some of it was, as you recognized, maybe in addition to alerting
Outside.
us to your frustrations, which we also have some frustrations,
Mhm.
you may want to communicate that to the people who actually can change the law. But in addition, since you made those comments and you want us to benefit from them, I would like to benefit from
Absolutely, there was a clerical error there, I thought that was,
them. Not a problem.
thank you for bringing that to my attention.
If you knew how many clerical errors I made, you would understand that I know where you're coming from.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker is Fran Siegel, U.S. Impact Investing Alliance.
Good morning, folks. Great to see you, many of you again. I'm Fran Siegel, Executive Director of the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance. So the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance and our members represent collectively about 1,000 private investors and financial intermediaries who are actively engaged in deploying private capital to advance the public good. We believe in leveraging the power of markets to create measurable social, economic, and environmental benefits, and that investors can play an important role in achieving desirable policy outcomes. Many of our members and our stakeholders have particularly deep knowledge of and track record in investing for community economic development. They include institutional investors, foundations, pension funds, university endowments, high net worth individuals, banks, and community development finance institutions that understand the importance of place, local context, and authentic community engagement when investing in low-income communities. For this reason, we have taken a keen interest in opportunity funds, opportunity zones, and the development of pertinent regulations. And it's based on consultation with these members that I offer the testimony to you today. In previous comments before you and in several iterations of written comments, we have underscored the critical importance of timely, accurate, and consistent data collection and reporting. We believe that of the remaining issues to be addressed by Treasury in its rulemaking, this is perhaps the most important, certainly the most important to us and the members that we represent. We are heartened to see that Treasury released a request for information on data collection and tracking in opportunity zones. And we're likewise glad to see that this issue has been taken up by the White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council. We're grateful to those of you here today and your colleagues throughout the administration for their efforts to elevate this topic of impact accountability, community engagement. Before I address data and reporting requirements, I'd like to first quickly address the issue of rules to prevent abuse. It was encouraging that the notice of proposed rulemaking included broad authority to recharacterize abusive transactions as non-qualifying. In final regulations, we recommend that Treasury should seek to provide greater clarity about the circumstances in which this authority may be exercised. Qualified opportunity funds are given great flexibility in deploying capital in opportunity zones. The authors of the statute were clear in their goal to see a broad range of operating businesses and other investments supported to meet the needs of qualified opportunity zones. Treasury in particular, with the latest proposed regulation, has approached the rulemaking process in a manner consistent with this intent. But this flexibility also creates significant room for abuse, and it would be impractical to enumerate every type of potential abuse. In our written comments, we articulate a three-part approach to this topic. First, in final rules, the IRS commissioner should maintain the broad authority to recharacterize abusive investments as such. Second, Treasury should define some clear potential abusive actions such as land banking to immediately prevent such predictable negative outcomes. And third, Treasury should consider the adoption of a safe harbor, such as independent certification of the community benefit practices of opportunity funds, to provide investors with an additional degree of certainty that their investments are being well managed, do not violate these abuse rules. We provide greater detail on all points of this approach in our written comments, but on this last point, I would like to underscore that the private sector tools needed to implement independent certification are already under development. Several speakers already mentioned this opportunity zones reporting framework, which is a private sector standard for reporting that was developed by our organization, the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, in partnership with the New York Federal Reserve Bank and the Beck Center at Georgetown. So a broad range of groups, including us, have worked to develop these frameworks, tools, and methodologies that could be used as the basis for an independent certification program. With a safe harbor tied to independent certification, we believe that significant numbers of opportunity fund managers would be incentivized to voluntarily take part. We believe that with sufficient participation, these market-led efforts would become financially viable, these certification efforts. Standards would need to be instituted for which certifications qualify for safe harbor protection, and these certifications would need to be continuously monitored over the course of the program. We believe that the CDFI fund would be naturally suited to handling this task, given their experience managing other effective community development programs. As discussed in my introduction, I want to spend the balance of my time on the vital importance of tracking and publicly reporting on fund and transaction level data about opportunity zone investments. The opportunity zones market cannot function efficiently without access to basic transaction data about qualified opportunity funds and their investments. For this reason, we recommend that Treasury collect and report publicly on basic fund and transaction level data about qualified opportunity fund activities in a consistent and timely manner. Doing so would achieve the goal of tracking the effectiveness of the policy and create multiple benefits directly increasing that effectiveness. While we applaud Treasury for its thoughtful RFI on this topic, the time-lagged and aggregated data envisioned in that document would be entirely insufficient to assess the efficacy of the policy. Fund and transaction level reporting should be collected in a manner other than through a tax form, likely through a web portal. And the information should be made available to the public in a disaggregated, anonymized, and timely fashion. Such reporting would not create a meaningful burden on qualified opportunity fund managers, and the public benefit of such reporting was articulated in a wide range of public comments submitted to Treasury to its RFI on the topic. The statutory language creating opportunity zones gives Treasury the necessary authority to collect and report basic fund and transaction data. Collection of this data will enable qualified opportunity fund managers to track and certify their compliance with statute, and the Secretary is given the specific authority to promulgate regulations that facilitate the certification of qualified opportunity funds. Furthermore, while we primarily see this data collection effort as a means to promote the efficient formation and deployment of capital, an ancillary benefit would be to inform Treasury in promulgating and enforcing rules to prevent abuse. Another point on which the Secretary has specific authority to institute reporting requirements. Finally, Treasury has repeatedly and clearly articulated that the purpose of the statute is to promote economic activity in opportunity zones. This intent is further supported by the statutory language and legislative history of Regulation 1400Z. In previous written comments, we have discussed at length the benefits that basic and transparent reporting will have for market participation. To quickly summarize this point, reporting will increase investor confidence, enable more efficient capital matching, and promote effective partnership with state and local governments. Again, the Secretary is given broad authority to promulgate rules that advance this legislative purpose and could, under that authority, institute reporting requirements. Such a reporting process would require a minimum level of staffing within Treasury to implement reporting, ensure completeness and accuracy of data, and prepare reports. The CDFI fund provides a model through its role in implementing and overseeing the New Markets Tax Credits Program, and we suggest that the Secretary consider leveraging this existing resource to support implementation of Opportunity Zones reporting requirements. Thank you once more for the opportunity to testify. We remain deeply optimistic that once these remaining points are clarified, this policy can be used to improve the lives of the 32 million residents living in Opportunity Zones today. The taxpayers of this country have made and will make a tremendous investment in the economic potential of Opportunity Zones. I urge you here today to give us the tools we need to measure and affirm the impact of those investments. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody on the panel? Question?
It would help even if it was not an exhaustive list for you to give us some examples of abuses which you think we ought to write into the regs, and in particular, what the consequences of those abuses ought to be for either the fund or the ultimate investor, the business, the fund, or the investors, because yeah, the IRS and Treasury are not special about being concerned about abuse, but we need to know. You refer to the importance of providing for independent certification, essentially of consistency with the legislative history's articulation of the purpose. There are a variety of questions that are related in part to who would do this. Would such certification be conclusory? In other words, you've got private actors, you've got a lot of money involved. It would not be unheard of for an otherwise magnificent independent force to get captured by the transactional process. The fascinating podcast by Michael Lewis, if you haven't listened to it. So would a positive response be absolutely conclusory? The IRS could not look behind it, say, we don't think that this was a fair and independent evaluation. What consequence of the failure there ought to be done? And are you imagining an appeal process for someone who says, I should have gotten my certification and you didn't give it to me, and it may have been negligence, it may have been a different judgment, it may have been corrupt, but it would be unusual and possibly inappropriate for some private actor, absent statutory delegation of responsibility, to get this kind of control over whether or not a taxpayer gets the benefits that the taxpayer thinks that it is entitled to. In terms of the transaction by transaction tracking, you said that, well, this isn't going to be collected by the IRS, and implicitly you seem to suggest that therefore it would not be subject to the privacy assurances in section 6103, part 2 for using numbers instead of concepts. I'm not sure that this would the kind of granular analysis which you're suggesting be made public. I mean, we're looking to whether or not that kind of granular information can be collected for government evaluation of what's going on, but making that kind of granular analysis public, even if, as you put it, anonymized, but disaggregated, if there's a transaction that is described and it is in census tract X, and there's only one fund operating in census tract X, being anonymized doesn't do much good. And so I think the privacy issues are important. And then finally, lacking explicit statutory mandate, you said there's regulatory authority, but not the statute. Suppose somebody says, I don't feel like filing this information. What are the consequences? Should the IRS enforce filing by denying the tax benefits? Should the filing be done with a jurat under penalty of perjury? I think the general desirability of taking a tax incentive which is as inviting, sort of y'all come, as this one is, with no aggregate limit on the amount of deferral that would be possible if enough people take up the invitation. The risk that all of the problems that Mr. Cunningham identified might come true are there, but concrete steps to ensure that what Congress says it wanted, it gets, are not simple or automatic.
Okay, I'll do my best to answer those. Wish I had taken my pen up here. So I'll do my best and happy to take some of this
If you
offline.
skip one, I may have to.
Yeah, I second the examples for abusive transactions.
Mhm. Okay, so just as a kind of a high level thought, we believe in, we're part of also the EIG coalition and the Reddit coalition, and our members feel that in exchange for the tax advantage capital that Opportunity Zones represents, that the disclosure of data so that we can ascertain the efficacy of a policy is a very reasonable trade.
Well, to that, you need to go somewhere else,
Mhm.
because that's not in the statute at this point, so.
Understood. And someone else mentioned that, that reporting was stripped out of the statutory language, for parliamentary reasons, and we're aware of that. I'm not able to speak about live legislation because I'm not allowed to lobby, so I won't opine on that topic, here, nor is it appropriate in this forum. But I'm just saying what our members believe. So we are communicating the testimony is two pieces around data. One is fund and transaction level data disclosed to a central data repository and then available to state, local, federal governments, policymakers, academics, as a way for us to ascertain whether the opportunity zone benefit has been efficacious. And our belief is that community economic development is a desired result. And so what we envision there, and I'll get to this piece about certification and rules to prevent abuse in a moment, but what we asked for actually in our first public comment letter, and I testified in this on Valentine's Day of earlier this year, we're asking for capital raised into an opportunity fund, property acquired, amount invested in each deal, indeed, location by census tract, NAICS code sharing the business type, so that we can start understand, and we actually ask for additional information, including jobs creation, percentage of units affordable where appropriate, new business starts, business ownership type with a special focus on women and minority entrepreneurs, and poverty reduction, which, you know, many folks believe that that is an outcome that should not be, that would be burdensome on the fund manager. And so we threw that in there, but I think that it's really important throughout all of these discussions around data to understand what is appropriate use of, and requests of fund managers, and what is best analyzed by policymakers and academics and think tanks. And so there, what we're envisioning is disclosure through a web portal, similar to the one that is used by the CDFI fund to administer new markets tax credits. I take your point about privacy, and if, you know, there is indeed one investment in one opportunity zone that is problematic. But we still believe that what was suggested in the RFI from Treasury was single numbers, complete kind of programmatic aggregation issued, you know, every handful of years, and we feel like that is insufficient. So that's kind of one topic, and I'll try to wrap it up. I see here we have a time constraint. On the issue of rules to prevent abuse, there what we're asking for is a certification safe harbor, saying that if you use a third-party certifier, indeed a private sector certifier, those certifiers which would be certified by, say, the CDFI fund in some kind of interagency agreement, in the same way that there was an interagency agreement between the IRS and the CDFI fund in certifying the 8,700 opportunity zones. And so, you know, you asked the representative from Opportunity Finance Network about this issue of certification. What we're asking here around the rules to prevent abuse, the safe harbor, a certification program where, say, a CDFI fund would certify the certifiers, so there wouldn't be need to be a certifier, and, you know, just your point, your question to OFN earlier today. So that's sort of what we imagine. I'm happy to disclose in writing answers to some of your other questions if you feel that I don't have time to answer them at this time. I see everyone.
Sorry.
Okay, well, thank
We would
you.
love to hear from you, but we have a lot of speakers.
One thing to add to that, and that is, when you do, a lot of people have criticized the selection by governors of, in some cases, census tracts that were gentrified, and by the time, and had in fact gentrified by the time the governors made the designation. Are you suggesting that there would be some impairment of investors' ability to go into those tracts because there really is little social benefit derived particularly from the loss of tax revenue?
The Urban Institute did a report, as you probably saw, that showed 3 to 4% of census tracts that were selected or have experienced gentrification, so it's still a relatively small percentage, but we know it's a concern. So I look forward to following up with greater details and examples on in a written
It may
format.
be more than 3 to 4% of the
Yeah.
total investment.
Pardon?
It may be more than 3 to 4% of the total investment
Yes.
into tracts.
Yes, understood. Well, thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay, our next speaker is Steve Glitman. He is from the Develop LLC.
Thank you to the panel for having me back to testify. I was here in February, testifying in the first round of regulations. I will be complimentary on the second round, but I will also have a number of issues in line with the first round of regulations, which just take as constructive criticism and nothing more, nothing less. My name is Steve Wickman. I'm the founder and CEO of Develop LLC. Between 2013 and 2018, I was the founder and CEO of the Economic Innovation Group, co-founder along with Sean Parker and John Lettieri, which was deeply involved with the architecture behind the Opportunity Zone program. Over the past year, I've spent most of my time in and around the country, talking and working with Opportunity Zone fund managers, with wealth managers, with community leaders, with Opportunity Zone businesses and developers and others, trying to educate various parts of the country and various industries about the program and how it works, and working with individual clients as they attempt to utilize the program. And so a lot of these comments are built along in the spirit of how is the market practically responding to some aspects of this, and where do I think there may be some easy areas for the IRS in finalizing these rules to make this more workable along the intent of the program, which is one, to raise a transformative amount of capital for Opportunity Zone communities, and being able to do that through various types of fund structures, and also to ensure that the deployment of funds go both to operating businesses as well as real estate of all types, and I'll get to how a few of those pieces I think are playing out. I'm a member of the EIG, Opportunity Zone Coalition, and the Democratic Working Group, and I think both they, along with the ABA, have put together very thorough and excellent jobs at providing a very detailed look at the regulations, with recommendations that are broadly, I think, consistent with each other and overlapping, which I think is a good sign that the market's coalescing around where it needs. I think there are two big categories I want to point out. One relates to the formation of multi-asset funds, and one relates to the utilization of Opportunity Zones for operating businesses. And there's a few issues within there that I think the IRS needs to do more on before finalizing. The most important, I think, aspect for multi-asset funds is actually a very easy one. I think the IRS did a good job in the regulations in April of outlining an exit strategy for single asset exits out of multi-asset funds. And I know some commentary around different ways to structure it, but the far more important, I think, issue right now is that it's the only part of the regs, really, that the IRS left open to speculation from the investor community, in saying that's the only part of the regulations that investors and fund managers can't rely on. And the impact of that, I think, is quite substantial. While there are multi-asset funds in the market, it's not unreasonable as a multi-asset fund manager, when having to address questions from investors, to be concerned with the fact that they don't have a good answer to why that part of the statute hasn't been finalized, hasn't been allowed to, or why investors haven't been instructed they can rely on that part of the statute. My sense is that IRS assumed that this would be an issue that fund managers wouldn't have to address until much later on in their life cycle, because many of these funds are structured to exit 10 years or beyond. The reality is, the structuring decisions are being made right now. And without the clarity that you can exit out of single assets without a tax event, investors are much more hesitant to invest in those funds. And I think you're seeing that in the fundraising. I think multi-asset funds, while some are having success, many are facing a slower fundraising cycle than they expected, in part because of this feature of the regulations. So I think even before the full finalization of the regulations, for Treasury to put out an additional amendment or an additional piece of regulation to make clear that the existing rules can be relied upon, and of course IRS can change its mind or clarify further in finalizing the structure, would do a big part to getting more capital into the market. One piece, though, of the multi-asset fund structure that I think has created some questions in the market relates to depreciation recapture. Right now, it's fairly clear that exiting out of single asset or multi-asset real estate funds and the single asset basis, you would avoid depreciation recapture, because it would be treated as a capital gains, and the regs make clear that single asset exits would not be subject to capital gains. But if you're exiting out of, let's say, a renewable energy vehicle, where you're selling assets that would be treated as the sale of personal property and as ordinary income, out of a multi-asset fund, it reads right now as if the tax treatment would be different. You would be subject to a tax event unless you organize those assets into single asset funds. And of course, that's possible to do, but quite cumbersome if the goal is to, again, aggregate a lot of capital for, in this case, a renewable energy asset class or other sort of business asset classes within these zones. There's no policy reason why we should be treating real estate, let's say, different from renewable energy, and no reason you should have to enter into an exotic structure if you're structuring on real estate multi-asset funds in order to get the same benefit, which is to avoid depreciation recapture at the sale of individual assets after 10 years. The third piece, I'd say, is a little more controversial, but I think important. And after the October regulations, the Treasury and IRS made clear that there were three eligible classes of investments that opportunity zone funds can make. They can make equity investments, they can have preferred equity interest, and special allocations. Special allocations, I think, was read as much of the market as allowing full carried interest to receive the opportunity zone fund treatment. And in the April regulations, the IRS made clear that for any interests that are not purchased from an investment in the fund, as opposed to treated to by sweat out equity in the allocation, that those type of interests would be treated differently. And I understand the rationale for that, but I think it carries some unintended consequences. One of which is I think you limit the number of professional fund managers who are going to engage in the marketplace. As a fund manager, the primary benefit of this program is creating ease of capital raising. And for a lot of fund managers, that's important. For professional and other institutional fund managers, I think it's much less important. And not being able to tap into the opportunity zone benefit, I think will limit the amount of those type of fund managers we have in the market, which I would argue is important, given, as we've all seen, the complications of, or the complexity of the program and the rules involved, and the shared desire we all have to ensure these funds meet their intended purposes. But maybe the far more important issue is that it's starting to create, as I'm observing, a fundamental misalignment between fund managers and LPs. And that especially occurs in the case of opportunity-style real estate funds, where much of the value is derived in the first years of the construction or rehabilitation, and once you have stabilization, you start to have a diminishing return in those funds. That creates an enormous amount of pressure for fund managers to sell well before the 10-year mark. They may feel they have a fiduciary responsibility because they can meet they can receive at the highest price, 5 or 6 or 7 years into the marketplace, when investors, have a tax reason to stay ensure they can stay invested in that asset for 10 years or more. And there's no reason to have that misalignment. I'd argue with the carried interest treatment as was originally envisioned in the October regulations, it would create a natural alignment to ensure we have a long-term 10-year plus investments in these funds, where you don't then have this artificial misalignment between the length of time an LP, which is to stay invested in the fund, and the length of time a GP is incentivized to manage that capital. On the operating business side, I think there's some much more fundamental questions. The most important relates to how we treat these substantial improvement tests, and whether we are looking at it asset by asset or as an aggregate basis. It's fundamentally not practical to invest in an existing opportunity zone business and expect to improve each individual asset, which may be a chair or a computer or a desk, and frankly doesn't achieve much of the economic benefit that we were looking to achieve in this program. Much more important, I think, to take an aggregate look at the value of its tangible assets and ensure that opportunities on business is at least investing as much, just as you would in an analogous real estate example. And of course, in the real estate context, there's I think, some practical applicability here as well. Practically speaking, there are purchases all the time of a building, let's say an adjacent or adjoining parking lot, of which the building is going to receive a tremendous amount of improvement, but the parking lot won't, and there will be no economic case or business case to doubling the value of the parking lot, but you're still achieving the economic impact in that same area. So I think there's real reasons to think through the aggregate improvement test. I think the ABA laid out a very good way to do it in its comments, which I won't go into in detail because they did. But I think that will be important to ensure there's investing in existing operating business in the opportunity zones, as well as practical investment in certain types of real estate projects. The second issue, I think that's important, and I think we just need a minor clarification, is the treatment of the gross income test. So I think the IRS substantially, won't use that term, I think the US greatly improved its treatment of the gross income test between the October and April regs. One small note, though, it used language that the gross income test applied to activity in the zone of the business, which implies to some in the marketplace that they can't have opportunity zone businesses that stretch across multiple zones. Of course, that would be the goal, to have large growth businesses that can grow across multiple opportunity zones, and businesses that meet the other criteria should be able to meet the gross income test across its assets across multiple zones. And I know my time is expiring. I'll just make one other quick comment. And that is, I think there's a question about whether qualified opportunity zone businesses can hold subsidiaries. in the normal course of business and not be excluded from investment because of the non-qualified financial property test. The way that reads is it would prevent partnership interest in subsidiaries. Of course, this would be a normal way of doing business as a qualified opportunities on business or an investor in those businesses. And there should be a rule in place, and I think EIG and others have laid out a practical scenario of evaluating if you're wholly owned that subsidiary, invest at least 50% of it, that it would not be treated against your non-qualified financial property test. Without allowing for subsidiaries to be invested in, I think you're going to limit the size and type of businesses that can be practically invested in throughout this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Glickman. Any comments from the panel? Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Mike.
I'd be offended if Mr. Nucky did not.
I know, really, right? You have a time limit.
I assume that you're suggesting that there's a workable nexus rule for aggregation in the ADA comments, that we should assume that you're lending your way to it.
Yeah, of course there is. It relates to assets in tracts or adjoining tracts, contiguous tracts.
Mike, are you done? Yep. Just one question. You talked about exotic structures, and you mentioned 1245 recapture. What if you could just elaborate on that? Are you thinking of a situation whereby if you sold the partnership interest, the 1245 recapture would escape tax, where if it's a sale of assets, down one or two tiers, 1245 would not escape tax? And then by virtue of that difference in rules, if I understand where you're going, there might be an exotic structure whereby you have a single asset fund such that the partnership interest could be sold. Am I following you correctly?
Yeah, so it basically is just the difference of the language of 1250 and 1245 and how the regulations refer to the sale of single assets. They talk to the capital gains that then the investors would not be on the hook for anymore. And other parts of the statute, they talk about a full step up in basis in the interest. Of course, capital gains works fine as a 1250 asset because it's considered capital gains. So you could add language that said you escape ordinary income or capital gains, which I think Democratic has recommended. Right now, a workaround is to allow for interest at the feeder fund level to these individual QOFs, and they hold individual, let's call them renewable energy assets. And those, it could function in a similar way, but it's much more burdensome, because then you have to collect your investment for each individual asset and then transfer those interests back up to the feeder fund. And there's really no reason it should work differently from the real estate context. My sense is it's an inadvertent wording difference that could be corrected with an update in that wording.
Could the workaround also operate to eliminate all ordinary income other than 1245 recapture, such as sale of inventory?
Yeah, well, so I think in this case, the focus will be on the sale of the asset itself. So you're talking about selling what will most likely be an individual LLC gaining the asset and the full equivalent treatment to the full step up in basis of the value of that asset upon sale, so that there is no outstanding tax event on a non-real estate asset. So I think the goal is to get to that same result so that you don't have different results depending on the different types of assets that your qualified opportunities on the fund may own in a multi-asset vehicle.
But just to be clear, if I start a widget-making business in a qualified opportunity zone, are you suggesting that the income from the sale of the inventory that we sold in bulk? Okay. You're focusing your comments on the real estate aspects, the 1250 unrecaptured 1250 gain, and the 1245 gain. I'm just trying to figure out where you would draw the line as to what would be permissible to be eligible for the step up in basis.
Yeah, I think it's again to treat them in the same way as a sale on the real estate components of those assets, because it's the core of this is the tangible property in the zone and the sale of those assets at the end of the holding period.
We can follow up later. I'm just trying to understand whether the sale of the tangible could be extended to deal with a sale in bulk of a business that has a significant amount of other ordinary income assets such as inventory. And you're not proposing that?
I'm not.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Sure.
So I just want to confirm that your first comment is you believe that people are sitting on the sidelines because of our applicability rule, what we did to give Reliance.
Yes, I think that's why some investors are sitting on the sidelines in the multi-asset fund context, which is, I think will be the majority of the source of investment over time in this program, because it creates the structure that's most scalable. And I've talked to many investors that, and many fund managers who are having trouble confirming to the investors that they can make sales, individual asset sales, which is how most of these multi-asset funds are structured, at the end of 10 years, and provide them some kind of assurance that they're going to receive the tax treatment that they're expecting because of that language. And in part because that language is different than the language of the rest of the regulatory, of the rest of the regulations that were released in April.
And you're suggesting that what's necessary is reliance so that a structure which is created today would be able to look back to the proposed regulations in 2046 and apply the terms of those regulations, even if the final regulations are different.
Well, correct, just like,
I want to make sure that we're communicating effectively.
no, correct, just as you can anywhere else, that's laid out in the April regulations, and they also have long-term consequences. And the reality is there are now, a not insubstantial amount of multi-asset funds in the marketplace that are having to essentially, sell on a faith and a prayer that their analysis of where the rents are likely to end up, that these vendors are going to avoid a tax event, are in fact true. So everyone in the market is taking on some amount of liability in interacting with their investors and others, that this structure and the tax treatment that they're committing to their investors will be there. I'm confident that's where the IRS plans to go, but that's not enough for many investors to feel like they can deploy capital now into the marketplace.
Okay, anybody? No? No? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. All right, our next speaker, we have two, Dan Cullen and Daryl Steinhaus from the Institute for Portfolio Alternatives.
Good morning. My name is Daryl Steinhaus. I'm with ELA Piper. Dan Cullen and I are here representing the Institute for Portfolio Alternatives. And I want to go over a couple of issues today that I think we could improve the regulations and provide some additional guidance. The first is somewhat what Steve talked about before, which is aligning exit strategies. When we look at these transactions today, there's three ways you can get out of these deals. The investors can sell their units. You can have the qualified opportunity zone property sold, which are typically partnership interest, or you can sell the underlying business/project. In most of the deals done today, we have a fund on top, we have a partnership below, and the partnership below owns right now typically a piece of real estate. And the problem is, depending on where